Planet of Evil is possibly the first Doctor Who story that's really an all-out horror, with a large supporting cast gradually getting bumped off one by one. This works reasonably well when you can't see the monster and have only the actors' performances to go off. But when you can see it, it's just a load of red lines and clearly two-dimensional. Obviously it's hard to represent an abstract concept like antimatter on screen, but it's a shame they couldn't think of anything better. Where the story does excel is in the sets, which are absolutely spectacular. Convincingly creating an alien jungle full of multicoloured plant life. It works a lot better in the sequences especially shot on film, rather than the studio sequences set on video, but that's par for the course with Classic Who. The spaceship set is also an interesting design, with a multi-level bridge and doors that open right behind staircases, so the actors have to duck around them. You don't get that in Star Trek. In fact, it could be argued that this is the first Doctor Who story to be inspired by Star Trek, as the basic format of a spaceship crew exploring a strange alien planet is definitely quite similar. But this seems to be just a coincidence, as the writer was inspired by the movie Forbidden Planet, which also inspired Gene Roddenberry to create Star Trek. Though Planet of Evil is arguably more faithful to the movie because it's kept the all-male crew, even though we're halfway through the 1970s by now. It'll be interesting to see how many more Doctor Who stories we get with no female characters in the guest cast. Most of the crew are just there to be killed off, the exceptions being Prentice Hancock as Controller Salamar, and Ewan Solon as his second-in-command Wyszynski. Salamar is clearly far too young and inexperienced for the job, constantly leaping to the wrong conclusions and always thinking the worst of the Doctor and Sarah. So he's extremely easy to dislike. Meanwhile, Wyszynski is the more experienced and wiser character, so you do find yourself rooting for him. And fortunately, he ends up being one of the few survivors. We also get Frederick Jaeger as Professor Sorensen. For most of the story, he's a classic mad scientist, obsessed with taking the antimatter away from the planet, even though people die every time they try to. But then halfway through the story, he starts drinking bubbling potions and transforming into a hairy beast. And the story suddenly turns into Jekyll and Hyde. It feels like it's come out of nowhere, and they really should have set it up earlier. Weirdly, despite being a mass murderer, Sorensen ends up surviving at the end, which turns out to have been a note from producer Philip Hinchcliffe. On balance, he's probably right. It would have been one death too many. But it does leave you wondering exactly how responsible he was for his actions. This is also one of the first stories where the Doctor is portrayed as much more alien than normal. The first three Doctors were technically alien, but still managed to come across as human and relatable. But here Tom Baker introduces the idea of the Doctor being an all-knowing higher being. It's not something that comes through often, as the production teams usually want the Doctor to come across as basically human, but it's always interesting when this element of the Doctor's character pops up, as it does later on when Sylvester McCoy takes over, and even later with Peter Capaldi. The DVD has a 25-minute making-of feature, concentrating mainly on the production elements and the construction of the elaborate jungle set, and there's also a separate 13-minute feature concentrated on the actor side of things. It's an interesting way of doing it, but most of the DVDs manage to get by with just the one making-of. So it's not entirely clear why this one's gone a different route. Overall, a fairly average story, with some interesting touches. I'll give it a 5. Next week it's Pyramids of Mars, which I'm pretty sure is a lot better. Meanwhile, if you check the link in the description, you can see the playlist of all my past reviews, or you can subscribe if you want to make sure to catch all my future reviews. See you next time.